Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to take a look at the 1915 Battle of Neuve Chapelle. World War I is a really big subject, and I've been messing around trying to find a framework to go off that will make tactical development a little bit more manageable to get across. It's not like everybody followed a straight path from pre-war linear rifle-dominated tactics like we saw in the last video at Mons, through the trench-dominated warfare of the mid-war period to the semi-open combined arms late-war modern warfare of 1918. It was messy, it was difficult, and it was fragmented, and in the kaleidoscopic experience of war, units could learn different lessons from the same experience. They could learn the wrong lessons, they could learn the right lessons by accident or for the wrong reasons, they could absorb or ignore lessons learned being communicated from above, and key personalities in tactical development and thought could be gained or lost through battlefield casualties, reassignments, or promotions. In other words, it's a lot more complicated than I can get across here, and we're going to be dealing with the broad strokes. To start off with though, it's worth taking a look at where the trenches came from. The early stages of World War I broadly fit into the classical mode of campaigning. Armies manoeuvred until they made contact with the opposition and fought a battle, after which one side would remain on the field and the other was either destroyed or withdrew. This is how everybody fought, from Alexander to Napoleon. This is what happened at the First Battle of the Marne. The great German right hook through Belgium was met by redeployed French armies plus the BAF, and after the battle, the Germans retreated. The Allied forces pursued the Germans and encountered them dug in on high ground overlooking the River Aisne and fought another battle, the First Battle of the Aisne. The Allies failed to dislodge the Germans, but were going to have some problems if they followed the classical campaign script and fell back. To begin with, they were giving the Germans space and freedom to manoeuvre. As it was, the German armies on the Aisne were dug in and stationary. The Allies knew where they were, and they were already in position to repel any German attacks or take advantage of any opportunities the Germans might present if they decided to disengage. Thanks to the developments in firepower that we've been looking at in this series, defensive firepower has greatly increased. By this point, it's pretty clear to everybody that entrenched infantry can repel a much greater number of attackers. This translates into economy of force. The Allies don't need to stack up divisions on the Aisne if they're now on the defensive there. They can pull troops out of the line without sacrificing their defensive strength and redeploy them elsewhere. The combination of defensive economy of force, mass armies, and a developed theatre of war with a dense rail network meant that both sides, because all of the previous also applies to the Germans, had the available manpower to start trying to fix the enemy to their front and manoeuvre onto their flanks in pursuit of a decisive engagement. The result was a series of battles known as the Race to the Sea, in which neither side gained the decision they wanted, and both the Allies and the Germans eventually ran out of room at the Channel coast. The line was already fairly well established south of the Aisne, all the way to the Swiss border, and the result was a continuous line of contact, a continuous line of entrenchment along the entire Western Front. After this point, there were no flanks to turn. Both sides could only attack the other frontally, from their trenches, across no man's land, towards the enemy trenches. This is an issue for the Allies, because they have more of a political imperative to attack. The French need to force the German army off French soil and fix German forces on the Western Front to relieve pressure on their Russian ally. The British need to demonstrate to the French that they can contribute to the war effort. The result is that early 1915 sees a string of offensives, including major French efforts in Artois and Champagne, and a keystone British attack on the village of Neuve Chapelle. This was the first major British set-piece attack after the emergence of positional warfare, and the first British attempt to tackle the problems of trench warfare. The village itself had been fought over before during the Race to the Sea, with the Germans pushing the BEF out and creating a salient projecting into the British lines when the front solidified. Salients allow an attacker to put convergent fire or mount convergent attacks from several directions at once, making them prime places for offensive action, and only about 4 kilometers beyond Neuve Chapelle is the only high ground in the area, Aubers Ridge. High ground is a relative term. The entire region is flat as a pancake, and Aubers Ridge itself is apparently barely noticeable when you're standing on it, but it would serve as key terrain to unlock further advances in conjunction with French forces to the north and south. With Aubers Ridge secure, the Allies could start pushing for the occupied French city of Lille, a key rail hub whose recapture would cut German supply lines to a large section of front and force them to fall back. That's the strategic and operational situation. It was BEF's 1st Army commander, then Lieutenant General Sir Douglas Haig, who initially suggested an attack at Neuve Chapelle to his superior Sir John French on the 12th of February. A few days later, French approved the suggestion, ordering that the attack go in after the 9th of March, weather and ground conditions permitting. Haig had 2 corps to command for the offensive, and immediately ordered them to submit plans for their roles by the 20th of February. 4th Corps, made up of territorial units under Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson, was to storm Neuve Chapelle itself and then push on to Aubers Ridge. The Indian Corps under Lieutenant General Sir James Wilcox, made up of troops from the Indian Army, was to attack south of Neuve Chapelle, clearing the area south of the village and the Bois de Bise, securing the immediate flank of 4th Corps' movement towards the high ground. The plans generated by Rawlinson are quite interesting. On the 20th, he submits a plan to isolate Neuve Chapelle on day 1 and then occupy it on day 2, not mentioning any kind of movement onto the ultimate objective of Aubers Ridge. Haig considers the original pitch to be too vague and lacking in important details, like which units are going to do what, and orders Rawlinson to fill those details in. 2 days later, he submits that more detailed plan, explaining how 2 brigades will attack to isolate the village on the first day through a pincer movement, and then move in to clear it on the second. Haig isn't happy with this, primarily because by the second day the attack on Neuve Chapelle itself will have lost the element of surprise. The British troops clearing the village will start too close to be safely supported by an artillery bombardment, and because after the village is seized, the 2 brigades will have to completely change direction to move on Aubers Ridge, a manoeuvre complex and difficult enough when not in contact with the enemy. So Haig orders Rawlinson to come up with something better, and to do it quick. 3 days after that, we're up to the 25th of February now, during which time Haig has discovered that Rawlinson has basically been farming responsibility for the plannings out to his divisional commanders and is not impressed. Rawlinson presents a much simplified plan in which 4th Corps attacks and seizes Neuve Chapelle on day 1. Haig is finally satisfied, writing that the operation was now to be carried out as I wished in a simple, common-sense way. I agreed that this plan was much better than his first complicated proposal. What's interesting about this rolling exchange, and the reason for spending a little time on it, is that Haig and Rawlinson were both Boer War veterans and had clearly drawn different tactical lessons from their experiences. While all this planning is going on, 1st Army is collecting as much information about Neuve Chapelle and the surrounding area as possible, and they're farming as many sources as they can to do so. There is an influx of intelligence on German positions from the troops already in the front line via simple observation and patrolling no man's land, but 1st Army is aware that this only informs them about the crust of the German defences. On the human intelligence side, they track down and interview displaced residents of Neuve Chapelle to get information about the village itself, identifying, for example, the strongest built buildings and buildings with cellars in order to plot potential German positions. On the image intelligence side, 1st Army works with the Royal Flying Corps to generate some of the earliest trench maps via aerial photography. This is primitive, to say the least, literally involving leaning over the side of an aircraft and trying to use a commercial camera, but 1st Army is able to build up a picture of the German defence behind the front line. This is critical for the major component of the attack, the fire plan. Haig is under no illusions that the infantry can advance without artillery support, and he's gone out of his way to get as much artillery as possible for the attack. This has 3 major roles: to destroy or suppress German positions, to isolate the battlefield by stopping local German reinforcements from moving in, and, critically, to cut the wire. Trenches are hard enough to deal with alone, but with even a few layers of barbed wire in front to hold up the attacker and allow the defender time to react, they can become borderline impregnable. So the BEF has spent considerable amount of time trying to find ways to solve the barbed wire problem. After a lot of testing, they decide that the way to do it is to hit it with shrapnel shells. This might seem a little backwards, you'd expect high explosive to do a better job, but the blast effect just tends to lift the wire up and dump it back down in more of a mess, while the shrapnel cone from an artillery shell is dense enough to snap many individual strands. There are two important consequences to the fire plan. The first is due to the simple mechanics. The guns are not going to be engaged in direct fire over open sights, they are going to be firing indirectly. This requires the guns to register their targets in advance. Predicted fire off a map is not yet developed into an effective method, so batteries need to fire a few shells that forward observers in the front line, or wireless equipped aircraft above the front line, can correct onto their targets. The battery then notes the data they need to replicate that on-target shooting on the big day. This obviously requires the guns to be moved into position before the attack, and any sensible defender who notices an increase in registration fire or extra enemy artillery moving into the area is going to get very suspicious very quickly. So to try and maintain the element of surprise, the British conduct this preparation slowly and at a low intensity. The second consequence of the fire plan is that the attack becomes highly scheduled. Batteries have orders to expend specific numbers of rounds on specific targets at specific times, with the bombardment starting out focused on the German front line and then shifting to positions in depth. The infantry have to conform to this fire plan. At any stage, if they attack too early, they risk running into their own artillery fire. If they attack too late, any surviving defenders may have recovered from the shock of the bombardment and be able to put up effective resistance. In other words, the attack plan is very rigid. There's little scope for the troops on the ground to take advantage of fleeting opportunities if things go well, or to adjust the artillery if things go badly. Finally, on the artillery front, there is a good deal of back and forth over how long the initial artillery preparation should be. Rawlinson prefers a short 30-minute bombardment, Haig is in favour of 3 hours, and Haig's artillery advisor, Major General Mercer, wants 6 days. In the end, it became apparent pretty early on that the British Army simply didn't have the reserves of artillery ammunition necessary for a prolonged bombardment. Production back home was not keeping up with expenditure, something that would ultimately escalate into the 1915 shell crisis and topple the British government, so Rawlinson's half-hour barrage became the only option. There are reams of extra preparations in the run-up to the attack too. The frontline trenches can't fit the assault waves in, so new assembly trenches need to be dug to hold them under cover prior to going over the top. Then the mechanics of moving to these assembly trenches and from there into the front line for the attack have to be carefully planned out, not least because they will be taking place in the dark the night before the attack. Engineering supplies are stockpiled near the front lines so that Royal Engineer units following up the assault can quickly fortify captured positions with barbed wire and sandbags. Miles of telephone wire are laid crisscrossing the rear areas so that the attacking brigades can keep in contact with their divisional headquarters, and so the artillery batteries can be kept in the loop. Elsewhere along the front, the units slated for the attack are pulled out and concentrated, while those who are to remain in place stretch out to fill the gaps. In some areas, diversionary attacks and demonstrations are planned to try and mislead the Germans as to the scale of the offensive. 0 hour is set at 08:05 on March the 10th, and the assault troops move into position the night before. The flat terrain overlooked by Auber's Ridge means they can't be kept in close proximity for fear of being spotted, so they have to march several miles to get to the assembly trenches and then the front line. The British wire has already been removed, so it won't impede the attack, and at 07:30 the artillery opens up. Haig has managed to bring over 300 pieces to the battle and concentrated on such a small area of front that translates into a density of 1 gun for every 6 yards. The heavier artillery, with their bigger shells and greater danger areas, target Neuve Chapelle itself, the routes into the village, and identified German strongpoints in depth, while the lighter pieces engage their targets of the German wire and frontline trenches with less danger to the waiting assault troops. The trenches themselves in this area can't be dug very deep due to the high water table. They simply fill up with water only a few inches down, so positions have been built up with breastworks and sandbags. Unfortunately for the Germans, and for some of the British troops hit by short shells, these aren't as effective as deep trenches. Along most of the line, the wire is successfully cut and the German frontline positions are shattered. At 08:05, the bombardment lifts according to the fire plan, and the British troops go over the top. No man's land is mostly 50 to 60 yards across, and with the wire cut and the defenders shocked and reeling, for the most part they overrun the German trenches without any significant problems. The trenches themselves are filled with shell-shocked or dead defenders, knots of resistance are quickly overwhelmed with bayonets and hand grenades, and there are plenty of Germans trying to surrender. The Royal Berkshires and Lincolnshires of 25th Brigade, for example, come under flanking fire as they cross no man's land, but the wire in their way has been completely destroyed, and all 4 assault waves reach the German trenches by 0820. They quickly send bombing parties armed with hand grenades down the trenches on their flanks and to their front to clear out and mop up remaining defenders. Following them up, 2nd Rifle Brigade passes them and waits there for the artillery hammering Neuve Chapelle itself to lift according to schedule so they can attack the village. The village itself is an absolute wreck by this point, having been pulverised by the bombardment, but it still needs to be cleared of resistance and surrendering Germans. In the few places where the bombardment is not effective, the attacking units suffer heavy casualties. In 25th Brigade's area, for example, the 2nd Middlesex finds the wire to its front uncut and the German defence intact. Responsibility for the bombardment in this area had fallen to 2 howitzer batteries that were late getting into position and had not had time to register properly. As a result, the assault waves of the 2nd Middlesex are mown down by rifle and machine gun fire. While some of them manage to reach the wire, they aren't able to get through it into the trenches beyond. In general, though, the initial phase of the attack goes to plan, and by mid-morning, Neuve Chapelle itself has been taken. Despite some hold-ups here and there as the result of local tactical conditions, the British look to have achieved their initial aims very quickly and with relatively low casualties. After this, however, they lose momentum and bog down. In some cases they are unable to rapidly exploit because they're tied to the rigid artillery fire plan, being forced to wait until the barrage lifts. In other places, small knots of German resistance that have survived the bombardment intact have simply not been identified and accommodated into the fire plan, or have been rapidly set up by local reinforcements, put up fierce resistance. In this kind of flat terrain, a single machine gun nest is a serious tactical problem and is capable of stopping advancing troops in their tracks. These hold-ups have follow-on effects. Some units are reluctant to push forward unless the units on their flanks have caught up, and delayed units fall behind the barrage, losing the advantage of its effects. This is in addition to the usual battlefield chaos and confusion. Units become fragmented and intermingled, get lost, lose their officers, lose contact with their superiors, and otherwise struggle to communicate. The Germans use this time to react, throwing in their local reserves to try and stabilise the situation, while they start to bring up deeper reserve units by rail to organise a significant counterattack. By the end of the day, British forces have generally reached the line of the old Smith-Dorrien Trench and start digging in. Despite the quick progress in the morning, they've not gotten very far beyond Neuve Chapelle itself, only a few hundred metres at the most. Some units from the Indian Division on the right send patrols out into the Bois de Brise and find it unoccupied, but they're ordered to dig in further back, and the Germans reoccupy the wood overnight. A major component of the day has been the difficulty in higher level commanders to effectively influence the battle. Telephone wires from headquarters positions to the original front line are frequently cut by German artillery fire, and the best means of communication across no man's land are runners. Not only are they much slower than a telephone call, but they have a tendency to get killed by artillery and, when they're closer to the fighting, small arms fire. As a result, the British commander's view of the battle is both delayed and incomplete, giving them a poor understanding of the situation to make further decisions on. Worse, this delay and incompleteness works both ways, so the orders they do issue arrive late, by which time the situation has changed and potentially rendered them irrelevant, if they arrive at all, which has the cascading effect of plans disintegrating as some units receive new orders, whilst others don't. Regardless, the first day has been successful. Neuve Chapelle has been secured and the salient projecting into the British lines straightened out. Overnight, the British make preparations to continue the advance towards Aubers Ridge at dawn. The morning of March the 11th is overcast and misty, meaning that the new British preparatory bombardment is fired mostly blind. The Germans have solidified new positions overnight, many of which are either unknown to or cannot be accurately pinpointed by the British in the front line, while those that are known either cannot be passed back to headquarters for inclusion in the hastily thrown together fire plan in time, or are difficult to target accurately because there is neither time, light or visibility on the misty morning to properly register the guns. As a result, the bombardment is almost entirely ineffective. In the area of the Bois de Bise, for example, the British artillery hits the wood, but the Germans aren't in the wood, they've dug in front of it and remain entirely intact and unsuppressed. Compounding this, the carefully prepared assembly and communication trenches that allowed the British assault troops to quickly get into position and attack on the first morning are absent here. In the flat terrain, battalions that have assembled behind the front line overnight frequently have to cross the open ground between Neuve Chapelle and the new front line under heavy machine gun fire before they can even attack. In addition, German artillery directed by spotters up on Aubers Ridge is able to bombard the village itself and the previous no man's land, again cutting unprotected telephone wires and killing runners, severely cramping British communications. The offensive achieves only minor gains at high cost, and the day ends without any serious progress, the British instead concentrating on making their new positions more defensible overnight and trying to get themselves organised again. The morning of March the 12th sees British preparations for more attacks, with a 30-minute preparatory bombardment starting at 10 to be followed up by the infantry, but this is preempted by a major German counterattack. This attack had been intended to go in the morning before, but the German troops that carried it out were delayed and fell back to the other side of Aubers Ridge before daylight, so they wouldn't be caught out in the open on the forward slope under the eyes of British artillery. Just before dawn, the Germans put their own preparatory bombardment in, but they suffer from many of the same problems of the British artillery. Although the British do suffer casualties among units forming up behind the front in and around Neuve Chapelle, the front line remains mostly untouched and unsuppressed. Taking advantage of more morning mist, the German infantry follow up, but suffer the same fate as the British attacking the day before. Although they manage to seize a few sections of trench, most of the German counterattack is stopped dead by rifle and machine gun fire. Those elements that did make it into the British trenches are counterattacks by bombing parties, and for the most part cleared out. As a result, the scheduled British attack is delayed 2 hours until 12, but this still isn't enough time for the artillery to effectively register. Once again, the bombardment is ineffective, and once again, the attack takes heavy casualties in exchange for negligible progress, compounded by the same kinds of communication problems as the previous 2 days. By the end of the 12th, neither side has achieved anything more of note, and the battle for Neuve Chapelle is over. The British have taken the village itself, but the Germans have prevented them from exploiting their success and breaking through to Aubers Ridge. Figures vary, but both sides took about 12,000 casualties. There are a couple of key takeaways here. Firstly, the initial phase of the attack was highly successful. Neuve Chapelle itself and most of the German salient into the British line was taken within a few hours, with relatively low casualties. So when the preparations were effective, when the artillery was accurate, and when everything went to plan, the British did very well. After the initial phase, when the reality started to diverge from the planning, the British took heavy casualties and made little progress. So it's obvious that the key to success is effective coordination between the infantry and the artillery. At the beginning of 1915, the basic tactical unit of the infantry is still the entirely rifle-armed company. Hand grenades are present on both sides at Neuve Chapelle, but at least for the British, these are mostly the preserve of specialised battalion-level bombing parties. As such, the infantry needs the artillery to suppress and destroy entrenched enemy infantry in order to attack successfully. They don't have the kind of organic integrated firepower to be able to operate on their own. This is fine when the entrenched enemy positions have been identified before the battle and the guns pre-registered on them. However, this requires not only considerable time and preparation, but good reliable communications, which the attacking infantry cannot maintain once they've crossed no man's land. In other words, if the infantry encounters a new or previously unidentified enemy position, they can't get timely or accurate artillery support to deal with it. And because they don't have the organic firepower to deal with it themselves, they either get stuck, or they try to advance, suffer heavy casualties, and then get stuck. And there will always be previously unidentified enemy positions. Gathering accurate information beyond the enemy front line is very difficult. Probably the best way is aerial reconnaissance, but this has its own difficulties and restrictions brought about by technical limitations, weather effects, and, because every action has a counteraction, enemy anti-aircraft fire and fighters. When the plan inevitably diverges from reality, when the infantry inevitably encounter unforeseen problems that throw them off the rigid timetable, when the enemy reacts, things start to rapidly break down and go sideways. In the conditions of 1915, the infantry-artillery coordination that is necessary for effective offensive operations can only be achieved through extensive preparation and rigid integration of the infantry into the artillery's fire plan, both of which have limits. Once events have progressed beyond those limits, which they will always do, the attack fails. At the Battle of Neuve Chapelle, the British hit that limit only a few hours after they started the attack, while the major German counterattack on the third day failed to get off the ground at all, and mostly appears to have just inflated the German casualty count. The natural progression of the attack, then, is to break up offensives into a series of bite and hold operations, instead of looking for a climactic breakthrough. Instead of trying to punch a hole in the enemy lines for exploitation, attacks should concentrate on pulverizing a shallow chunk of the enemy line with a meticulously planned artillery bombardment before the infantry occupy the shattered target zone and defend it from counterattacks. This may seem sensible, appealing within tactical means, and much lower in casualties than some of the alternatives, but it's also a way of fighting that is far too time-consuming to align with political goals, and, potentially, the economic or societal sustainment of the war. At Neuve Chapelle alone, the First Army expended more artillery ammunition than the British Army did in the entire Boer War. By the end of the battle, it was down to its reserve stocks. The shell manufacturing capacity of the British in particular has simply not been fully mobilised by early 1915, meaning that the BEF can't carry out multiple attacks like this at a strategically useful pace. In addition, the lessons learned at the time are much less clear than they are in hindsight. In particular, looking from a larger operational perspective than a smaller tactical one, the cause for failure is pretty obvious. The British attacked on a very small front, and when they achieved a break-in, the Germans only had a very small hole in their lines to plug with reinforcements. This is, of course, completely true, though it has some natural follow-ons that do not gel well with the tactical environment. First, it suggests that a breakthrough could have been achieved if the attack had been mounted on a larger scale, and second, attacking on a larger front would inevitably dilute the concentration of artillery that was one of the keystones of the British success here. The bombardment was the key element of the battle, and one of the reasons it was so successful was that there were so many guns focused on such a small area. Extending the frontage of the attack immediately reduces the effectiveness of the artillery, unless the BEF can get a lot more guns. It will, of course, but it's going to be some time until the Royal Artillery has expanded to the necessary size. Finally, the Germans have a say in all this too. There are a great many defensive takeaways from Neuve Chapelle that, along with lessons learned across the Western Front as the result of other Allied attacks, result in changes to German defensive practices. If the enemy can blot the front line out of existence with a hurricane bombardment, then obviously the front line needs to be either considerably more robust, or it needs to be more lightly held. Deep and/or hardened shelters capable of resisting heavy artillery fire are an absolute necessity so that the defenders can survive the bombardment and swarm to the surface the instant it stops to take up their positions. Given the firepower revolution, all it takes is a couple of machine guns to survive and win the race to the parapet in order to decimate attacking enemy infantry and pin them down out in no man's land until pre-registered defensive artillery can be called upon to annihilate them. This, of course, is slightly more complex than the simple expedient of building second, third, or even more defensive lines behind the front so that any Allied penetration has next to no chance of achieving a breakthrough before German reserves can be deployed by rail. These are really the seeds of German defensive systems of the late war, in the same way that extending and improving artillery-infantry coordination is the driver behind the British late war offensive systems, but neither side is there yet. What's really evident from the Battle of Neuve Chapelle in particular is that the combined arms system has been broken by the increase in firepower, and everybody is struggling to put it back together. 100 years earlier at Waterloo, the trinity of infantry, artillery and cavalry was at the peak of its game. All three arms had specific roles, could be easily integrated, and could communicate with one another. By 1915, accurate magazine rifle fire has pushed the cavalry off the battlefield, rendering them at best mounted infantry and at worst easy targets, their traditional screening and reconnaissance roles taken up by infantry on a static front and aircraft overhead. The artillery has also been forced off the battlefield by the hail of small arms fire, losing the ability to rapidly communicate and support the infantry with direct fire, and being forced to develop and learn less effective indirect fire techniques. The infantry are the only ones who've remained on the field, but they can only stay there if they dig in and become static to protect themselves from enemy artillery, and they lack the organic firepower to dislodge similarly dug in enemy infantry themselves. The problems are of communication and coordination between the arms, but the technology, techniques and practices aren't there yet in 1915. They can be scripted in to set-piece attacks like at Neuve Chapelle, but when the script runs out, the combined arms team breaks and progress stops. In the next video, we're going to skip forward a year to 1916 and look at a British battalion attack on the Somme to see how things have changed and see how the tactical environment is changing. Hope you all enjoyed this one and found it useful. I'll catch you in the next video.